everyone. This is Zoltán Kész from the Central European Affairs podcast. And my guest today is R. Daniel Kelemen, professor of political science and law from Rutgers University. Dan, a couple of days ago, you wrote a very interesting article in the Washington Post. It read that Fidesz had to leave the EPP in order to avoid a humiliating expulsion. Were you surprised at the happenings?
Well, I was not surprised that Orbán jumped before he could be pushed. I sort of always expected that if it came close to them expelling him, he would leave of his own accord so he could claim that he was the one leaving voluntarily. But I was surprised by the timing. It came a little quicker than I thought, this move from the EPP to change their rules of procedure so that they could at least expel the group. The timing came as a bit of a surprise.
What led to the expulsion? What led to the jump out, actually, not necessarily expulsion?
Well, like a lot of things, there's a big backstory, so I'll try to go quickly. I mean, the tensions between the EPP and Fidesz have been mounting for years. Of course, Fidesz has been a member the whole time, Orbán government, the past decade that they've been in power. They've been a member of the EPP, and they've benefited from the protection of the EPP. But as they moved further down the path toward autocracy in Hungary, there were more tensions. The EPP set out a number of red lines saying, well, don't cross these or else you might be expelled. In fact, he crossed all those red lines, and that did not lead to his expulsion, interestingly. It wasn't really, he wasn't expelled really on matters of substance like the attacks on academic freedom, freedom of the press, corruption, anything like that. Really, it was that he picked fights directly with the EPP leadership, right? It started with Juncker, where he was attacking him with these billboards. That was back 2 years ago in Hungary. That increased tensions. And the final sort of straws came in the fight over the budget in November and December, when Hungary was blocking threatening to block the budget and the recovery package because it opposed this idea of rule of law conditionality, right? And so there was a big fight between the EPP leadership and the Fidesz and Orbán over the budget and this idea of making funds conditional on respect for rule of law. And then the final straw in the context of that fight, Deutsch Tamás, the leader of Fidesz and the EPP, made a comparison of the leader of the EPP in the parliament to a Gestapo guard or something like that. And that was a bit too much, and that kind of started the wheels turning to cut off ties. So that was a long answer, but it's a big backstory.
Yeah, definitely. And you also mentioned it a couple of minutes ago, and also in the article, that Hungary has become an autocracy. However, you also write that a lot of people labeled the regime a hybrid electoral authoritarian regime. Can you elaborate on what it means?
Well, okay, so these are terms that come both from political science and from a lot of the ratings bodies like Freedom House or the VDEM Institute, these kind of bodies that rate regimes. And I think the first thing that's most important for people to understand with these terms is that, we don't just have sort of flourishing democracies and then North Korea or something as the two regime types. We don't have bloody dictatorships and liberal democracies. There's a continuum, right, of regime types, but there are categories within that, right? And Hungary has moved from the category of a kind of pluralist democracy to in the eyes of most experts and analysts, to the category of what is variously labeled as, well, some people call it electoral autocracy, some call it competitive authoritarian, some call it hybrid. Those are the most common terms. And what those kind of regimes involve these are regimes that maintain the formal institutions of democracy. They have elections, there's multiple parties, but the system has been rigged by the ruling party so that the playing field is so tilted in its favor that winning elections for the opposition at the national level, is almost impossible. And that doesn't mean that they can't win locally, for instance, in cities. just like the opposition won Budapest, just as the opposition won Istanbul in Turkey, right?
Exactly.
So in these kind of regimes, there is some competition, right? But it's a deck that has been stacked in favor of the regime.
Now, you mentioned that it's almost impossible for the opposition to win in Hungary next year because parliamentary elections are coming up next year. And you're probably also aware of the fact that the Hungarian opposition parties have agreed to have one candidate in each constituency to run against Fidesz because they see that this strategy might work against Orbán. What do you make out of it?
Well, certainly uniting the opposition in any kind of competitive authoritarian regime, these type of regimes, uniting the opposition to take on the ruling party is always going to be the best strategy and the most hopeful one, to possibly prevail. However, I have doubts of whether Orbán would really let them win. We know from past elections, that he's used his control, because part of his regime is to centralize control over all previously independent bodies. So things like the election regulator, right? We've seen how he uses that to issue bogus fines on opposition parties and things like that. So, I'm hopeful. I like to be an optimistic person, right? But, I would suspect that in the run up to the election, we will see moves by the Fidesz regime to further disadvantage the opposition, either through control manipulation of media, through using their control of the election regulator to further disadvantage those opposition parties. So we'll see. But I find it hard to believe he's going to let himself lose, given how much control he has and how much is at stake for him.
Yeah, how much is at stake for him? Definitely, a lot of people say that the alternative for Orbán is going to prison. Definitely. Now, you mentioned a positive thing about the united opposition. Were you surprised that all parties, including Jobbik and the Socialist Party from right and left, have united?
Well, yeah, of course, the fact that the opposition was willing to go into a united coalition with Jobbik, surprised many people, given the history of Jobbik, its origins in kind of neo-fascism in the far right. Now, of course, Jobbik has moderated its stances, tried to, in a way, reposition itself to the left of Fidesz. So that
have they been successful, in your opinion? Sorry.
Well, I mean, at least on the surface, in terms of its policies, I mean, I think you can't do away with the history, of that party, right? I think it's tainted forever. That being said, a short-term tactical alliance to kind of restore competitive multi-party system, right, that is to oust Fidesz, I can understand why the opposition would do that, for short term. It's distasteful, and of course that's one of the things that helped Orbán all along, is that one of the main opposition parties was so problematic, right? But it seems that they have to, they've decided, the opposition, that that's the only way to have any hope of dislodging Orbán for now.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you reside in the United States, but you have Hungarian roots. A theoretical question: if you were asked by President Biden to advise on the Hungarian situation and the upcoming elections, what would you tell him?
What would I advise? Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think it's the place of, any outside government to get involved in other countries' elections, so there's, I wouldn't advise anything like that. I guess what I would say is, speaking out in favor of free and fair, importantly, fair elections, giving encouraging words to sort of opposition parties about the importance of pluralism, that sort of thing, giving that kind of moral support would be important. And I think speaking, critically, I think it's important not to speak in euphemisms, but to speak directly. And, for instance, labeling, Hungary as an autocratic regime and kind of explaining to people, well, yes, there are elections, but the government has been manipulating those so that they're not fair. Saying that kind of thing, I think, is important. By contrast, I think what we've seen from the EU largely is a refusal. I've even been on panels with EU officials. No one will publicly sort of admit, other than a few MEPs, okay, they will, but in terms of commissioners or members of the council, no one wants to say things like Orbán is an autocrat, right? Because that would be very uncomfortable, because then they'd have to sort of acknowledge their failure to address the issue, right? So I do think the U.S. is in a way, a better position with the Biden administration, that because we're at a distance, we can speak honestly, right, without worries about dynamics in the council or something.
Yeah, definitely. Now let's come back to the European scene, since you also mentioned the European Union. What's the future like for Fidesz?
Well, it's all up in the air right now, of course, given, well, they've left the EPP group in the parliament. It looks like it's just a matter of time till they formally leave the entire EPP party. So they're looking for a new home, right? Now, of course, Orbán's fantasy, his dream would be to form a new coalition to the right of the EPP, bringing together, some of the parties and that are in, let's say, the ECR group, some of the parties that are in this identity group, and kind of forming a new far-right nationalist coalition. He said that himself the other day, right? I don't think that's going to happen. He's talked about that before, by the way, in 2019. It's very hard to unite the far right in Europe, thankfully, for many reasons. And I don't think he's going to succeed with that. So I think ultimately he's going to join this smaller party called the European Conservatives and Reformists, where Kaczynski and the PIS is located, and he'll move in there. I mean, in terms more generally of the EU's how the EU is dealing with democratic backsliding, I don't think his departure from EPP will change anything overnight, right? It's not like we're going to see a sudden crackdown, something like that. However, I do think that basically because the EPP was so crucial in providing him with political protection against EU censure in various ways for years, the fact that he's leaving, this at least opens the door for tougher action from Brussels on the Orbán regime, and others.
Yeah, what changed in the EPP? So why was there a sudden change so that they would be ousted?
Well, like I said, I mean, first there's just the internal fights, the insults, calling the leaders Gestapo or comparing them to the Gestapo. There's all that stuff. But then I think there's also some broader strategic calculations coming forward. Merkel was a big defender of Orbán consistently, which, by the way, is an irony, because people always say Merkel is the leader of the free world, Orbán is the biggest far-right populist in Europe, but not a lot of people have appreciated that for a decade she's been his biggest protector in European politics. But anyway, she's on her way out the door, of course. So things are opening up in terms of German politics. There's a prospect in the new government in Germany, after the next elections, maybe the Greens would enter government. That's looking more likely. Now, the Green, in coalition with CDU, of course, but the Greens would be much more skeptical about CDU ties with the Orbán regime. So that's another consideration, in the future. So those, I think, are some of the things that we're weighing. Because keep in mind, there were already a number of parties that wanted Fidesz out of the EPP for the past 2 years. The real key thing that turned now is the move by the CDU and CSU, right? They were the key linchpin still defending Orbán, and that's what finally switched this week.
Will the EPP miss a Hungarian party?
Well, they'll miss their numbers, right? Because Orbán had actually a rather big delegation in the EPP with his Fidesz. So they're losing some, vice chairs of committees. They're losing some of the power that comes along with shrinking as a bloc. But I think, if it was only about Orbán and Fidesz, maybe EPP wouldn't have always been so desperate to stick with him, right? But I think their bigger concern is that he might succeed in taking others with him eventually. Maybe someone like Janša from Slovenia or others who have similar ideology, right? They basically, didn't want to leave much space to the right of themselves. There are, of course, parties to the right, the identity parties and ECR, but they were always worried. They wanted to have the biggest tent possible. And so they're worried about a bigger block of kind of nationalist politics to their right emerging at the EU level. Okay? So that remains to be seen, how that will play out.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. My guest today was our Daniel Kelemen, who is a professor of political science and law at Rutgers University. And we talked about his latest article in the Washington Post. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.